can't really see it. But hello. I usually do my wave, like, over here. But apparently that's not going to be a thing. Today I'm going to be reading part of Eragon. This is my personal copy. It's very well loved and old. It was one of my first books. It's my favorite book series, period. And it's, let's see if I could, actually find how many pages it is. It is 497 pages long. I'm only going to be reading a couple chapters of it today, because the reasons. A little bit of forewarning, I don't really read out loud at all. So forgive me on if I mispronounce things, because I'm going to be doing my own pronunciations. If I'm going to, forgive me if I stumble over words or if I talk too fast. If you need me to repeat something, I will. It's not hard to do. But what I do have is I have a little bit of an introduction. It's actually part of the reason why I was late, was I wrote out my own a little introduction for what I'm going to be doing today. So without further ado, let's get in the introduction, shall we? So before we start our adventure, I'm going to set the mood a little bit. You find yourself approaching a small but bustling city. About halfway through the region capital of Valora, this haven provides an apt respite from the woods behind you to the plains sprawling before you. Meridian is its name, and one of the many interesting tidbits you learned while at the Hunter's Lodge a couple weeks ago. Approaching the gate, you ask a guard for directions towards the nearest inn. She promptly tells you to go to the Bannered Mare, as there is oft a grizzled old man who will tell legends in exchange for an ear to listen. After trotting down the main thoroughfare for a short while, you noticed most of the citizens in the city are elven, not human like yourself. This thought echoing in your mind, you almost missed the elaborately carved sign of a horse rearing, signaling your arrival at the Bannered Mare. The inside is bustling, like most taverns of good repute are. A large fire crackling in the far wall, providing a welcome warmth from the autumn chill outside. There's a halfling in the corner playing a lute, and a gentle waltz to ease the mind of work and travel. The barkeep is an ever-smiling young elf, perpetually cleaning used mugs with an immaculate dish rag. After a brief inquiry, settling on a room and board for the week before you push on to Valora. Settling in at a table with a hearty mug of ale, you prop your bow, quiver, and mace up against a table leg and breathe a sigh of relief after finally being able to rest. You don't get to relax for overly long, however, as the halfling stops playing his lute, the tavern quiets, and an old man stands up from the table to your left. "Quiet, the lot of you," he says, his voice echoing through the tavern like a waterfall. "I won't repeat myself, so listen closely. This is the legend of Eragon, the first dragon rider of the New Age, and founder of the realm of Erathia." You get a better look at the old man as he sets a chair on the stage next to the back of the tavern. Strands of faded blonde hair stick out against the wolf's gray, and his left eye is covered by a patch. Also on the left side of his face are 3 long scars reaching in parallel from his ear to his chin. He has a scruffy beard, which is well kept, and his hair tied back in a loose ponytail. He has a black fur cape over a set of dull plate armor emblazoned with a forgotten crest of some fallen knighthood. From inside the armor, he pulls a small journal. "Shall we begin?" he questions, opening the journal. And so we shall. Now, if I had time to set this up a little better, I would have, but unfortunately I didn't, because of a couple of reasons. Okay. So the prologue, Shade of Fear. Wind howled through the night, carrying a scent that would change the world. A tall shade lifted his head and sniffed the air. He looked human except for his crimson hair and maroon eyes. He blinked in surprise. The message had been correct. They were here. Or was it a trap? He weighed the odds, then said icily, "Spread out, hide behind the trees and bushes, stop whoever is coming, or die." Around him shuffled 12 Urgals with short swords and round iron shields painted with black symbols. They resembled men with bowed legs and thick, brutish arms made for crushing. A pair of twisted horns grew above their small ears. The monsters hurried into the brush, grunting as they hid. The rustling soon quieted, and the forest was silent again. The shade peered around a thick tree and looked up the trail. It was too dark for any human to see, but for him, the faint moonlight was like sunshine streaming through the trees. Every detail was clear and sharp to his searching gaze. He remained unnaturally quiet, a pale, long sword in his hand. A wire-thin scratched curve down the blade. The weapon was thin enough to slip between a pair of ribs, yet stout enough to hack through the hardest armor. The Urgals could not see as well as the shade. They groped like blind beggars, fumbling with their weapons. An owl screeched, cutting through the silence. No one relaxed until the bird flew past. The monsters shivered in the cold night. One snapped a twig with his heavy boot. The shade hissed in anger, and the Urgals shrank back, motionless. He suppressed his distaste. They smelled like fetid meat, and turned away. They were tools, nothing more. The shade forced back his impatience as the minutes became hours. The scent must have wafted far ahead of its owners. He did not let the Urgals get up or warm themselves. He denied himself those luxuries too, and stayed behind the tree, watching the trail. Another gust of wind rushed through the forest. The smell was stronger this time. Excited, he lifted up a thin lip in a snarl. "Get ready," he whispered, his whole body vibrating. The tip of his sword moved in small circles. It had taken many plots and much pain to bring himself to this moment. It would not do to lose control now. Eyes brightened under the Urgal's thick brows, and the creatures gripped their weapons tighter. Ahead of them, the shade heard a clink as something hard struck a loose stone. Faint smudges emerged from the darkness and advanced down the trail. 3 white horses with riders cantered towards the ambush, their heads held high and proud, their coats rippling in the moonlight like liquid silver. On the first horse was an elf with pointed ears and an elegantly slanted eyebrows. His build was slim but strong, like a rapier. A powerful bow was slung on his back. A sword pressed against his side opposite a quiver of arrows fletched with swan feathers. The last rider had the same fair face and angled features as the other. He carried a long spear in his right hand and a white dagger at his belt. A helm of extraordinary craftsmanship, wrought with amber and gold, rested on his head. Between those two rode a raven-haired elfin lady, who surveyed her surroundings with poise. Framed by long black locks, her deep eyes shone with a driving force. Her clothes were unadorned, but her beauty was undiminished. At her side was a sword, and on her back a long bow with a quiver. She carried in her lap a pouch that she frequently looked at, as if to reassure herself that it was still there. One of the elves spoke quietly, but the shade could not hear what was said. The lady answered with obvious authority, and her guard switched places. The one wearing the helm took the lead, shifting his spear to a readier grip. They passed the shade's hiding place and the first Urgals without suspicion. The shade was already savoring his victory when the wind changed directions and swept towards the elves, heavy with the Urgal stench. The horses snorted with alarm and tossed their heads. Their riders stiffened, eyes flashing from side to side, then wheeled their mounts and galloped away. The lady's horse surged forward, leaving her guards far behind. Forsaking their hiding, the Urgals stood and released a stream of black arrows. The shade jumped out from behind the tree, raised his right hand, and shouted, "Garzjala." I butchered that, sorry. A red bolt flashed from his palm towards the elfin lady, illuminating the trees with a bloody light. It struck her steed, and the horse toppled with a high-pitched squeal, plowing into the ground chest first. She leapt off the animal with inhuman speed, landed lightly, and then glanced back for his guards. The Urgal's deadly arrows quickly brought down the 2 elves. They fell from the noble horses, blood pooling in the dirt. As the Urgals rushed to the slain elves, the shade screamed, "After her! She is the one that I want!" The monsters grunted and rushed down the trail. A cry tore from the elf's lips when she saw her dead companions. She took a step towards them, then cursed her enemies and bounded into the forest. Where the Urgles crashed through the trees, the shade climbed a piece of granite that jutted above them. From his perch, he could see all of the surrounding forest. He raised his head and uttered, "Poetic Istolry." A quarter mile of this forest exploded into flames. Grimly, he burned one section after another until there was a ring of fire, half a league across, around the ambush site. The flames looked like a molten crown resting in the forest. Satisfied, he watched the ring carefully in case it should falter. The band of fire thickened, contracting the area the Urgles had to search. Suddenly, the shade heard shouts and a coarse scream. Through the trees, he saw 3 of his charges fall in a pile, mortally wounded. He got a glimpse of the elf running from the remaining Urgles. She fled towards the craggy piece of granite at a tremendous speed. The shade examined the ground 20 feet below, then jumped and landed nimbly in front of her. She skidded around and sped back up the trail. Black Urgle blood dripped from her sword, staining the pouch in her hand. The horned monsters came out of the forest and hemmed her in, blocking the only escape routes. Her head whipped around as she tried to find a way out. Seeing none, she drew herself up with regal disdain. The shade approached her with a raised hand, allowing himself to enjoy her helplessness. Get her. As the Urgle surged forward, the elf pulled open the pouch, reached into it, and let it drop to the ground. In her hands was a large sapphire stone that reflected the angry light of the fires. She raised it over her head, lips forming frantic words. Desperate, the shade barked, "Garlsja." A red ball of flame sprang from his hand and flew towards the elf, fast as an arrow, but he was too late. A flash of emerald light briefly illuminated the forest, and the stone vanished. Then the red fire smote her, and she collapsed. The shade howled in rage and stalked forward, flinging his sword at a tree. It passed halfway through the trunk, where it stuck, quivering. He shot 9 bolts of energy from his palm, which killed the Urgles instantly, then ripped his sword free and strode to the elf. Prophecies of revenge, spoken in a wretched language only he knew, rolled from his tongue. He clenched his thin hands and glared at the sky. The cold stars stared back, unwinking, otherworldly watchers. Disgust curled his lip before he turned back to the unconscious elf. Her beauty, which would have entranced any mortal man, held no charm for him. He confirmed that the stone was gone, then retrieved his horse from its hiding place among the trees. After tying the elf to the saddle, he mounted the charger and made his way out of the woods. He quenched the fires in his path, but left the rest to burn. That was the prologue. Now on to the first chapter, which is called Discovery. Eragon knelt in a bed of trampled reed grass and scanned the tracks with a practiced eye. The prince told him that the deer had been in the meadow only a half hour before. Soon they would bed down. His target, a small doe with a pronounced limp in her left forefoot, still with the herd. He was amazed that she had made it so far without a wolf or bear catching her. The sky was clear and dark, and a slight breeze stirred the air. A silvery cloud drifted over the mountain that surrounded him, its edges glowing with ruddy light cast from the harvest moon cradled between 2 peaks. Streams flowed down the mountains from stolid glaciers and glistening snowpacks. A brooding mist crept along the valley's floor almost thick enough to obscure his feet. Eragon was 15, less than a year from manhood. His dark eyebrows rested above immense brown eyes. His clothes were worn from work. A hunting knife with a bone handle was sheathed at his belt. A buckskin tube protected his yew bow from the mist. He carried a wood frame pack. The deer had led him deep into the spine, a range of untamed mountains that extended up and down the land of Alagacia. Strange tales and men often came from those mountains, usually boding ill. Despite that, Eragon did not fear the spine. He was the only hunter near Carvajal who dared track game deep into its craggy recesses. It was the 3rd night of the hunt, and his food was half gone. If he did not fell the doe, he would be forced to return home empty-handed. His family needed the meat for the rapidly approaching winter and could not afford to buy it in Carvajal. Eragon stood with quiet assurance in the dusky moonlight, then strode into the forest toward a glen where he was sure the deer would rest. The trees blocked the sky from view and cast feathery shadows across the ground. He looked at the tracks only occasionally. He knew the way. At the glen, he strung his bow with a sure touch, then drew 3 arrows and nocked one, holding the others in his left hand. The moonlight revealed 20 or so motionless lumps where the deer lay in the grass. The doe he wanted was at the edge of the herd, her left foreleg stretched out awkwardly. Eragon crept slowly closer, keeping the bow ready. All his work of the past 3 days had led to this moment. He took a last steadying breath, and then an explosion shattered the night. The herd bolted. Eragon lunged forward, racing through the grass as fiery wind surged past his cheek. He slid to a stop and loosed an arrow at the bounding doe. It missed by a finger's breadth and hissed into the darkness. He cursed and spun around, instinctively nocking another arrow. Behind him, where the deer had been, smoldered a large circle of grass and trees. Many of the pines stood bare of their needles. The grass outside the charring was flattened. A wisp of smoke curled in the air, carrying a burnt smell. In the center of the blast radius lay a polished blue stone. Mist snaked across the scorched area and swirled insubstantial tendrils over the stone. Eragon watched for danger for several long minutes, but the only thing that moved was mist. Cautiously, he released the tension from his bow and moved forward. Moonlight cast him in a pale shadow as he stopped before the stone. He nudged it with an arrow, then jumped back. Nothing happened, so he warily picked it up. Nature had never polished a stone as smooth as this one. Its flawless surface was dark blue, except for thin veins of white that spiderwebbed across it. The stone was cool and frictionless under his fingers, like hardened silk. Oval and about a foot long, it weighed several pounds, though it felt lighter than it should have. Eragon found the stone both frightful and beautiful. Where did it come from? Does it have a purpose? Then a more disturbing thought came to him. Was it sent here by accident, or am I meant to have it? If he had learned anything from the old stories, it was that to treat magic and those who used it with great caution. But what should I do with the stone? It would be tiresome to carry, and there was a chance it could be dangerous. It might be better to leave it behind. A flicker of indecision ran through him, and he almost dropped it, but something stayed his hand. At the very least, it might pay for some food, he decided with a shrug, tucking the stone into his pack. The glen was too exposed to make a safe camp, so he slipped back into the forest and spread his bedroll beneath the upturned roots of a fallen tree. After a cold dinner of bread and cheese, he wrapped himself in blankets and fell asleep, pondering what had occurred. Chapter 2, Palancar Valley. The sun rose the next morning with a glorious conflagration of pink and yellow. The air was fresh, sweet, and very cold. Ice edged the streams, and small pools were completely frozen over. After a breakfast of porridge, Eragon returned to the glen and examined the charred area. The morning light revealed no new details, so he started for home. The rough game trail was faintly worn, and in places non-existent. Because it had been forged by animals, it often backtracked and took long detours. Yet for all its flaws, it was still the fastest way out of the mountains. The spine was one of the only places that King Galbatorix could not call his own. Stories were still told about how half his army disappeared after marching into its ancient forest. A cloud of misfortune and bad luck seemed to hang over it. Though the trees grew tall and the sky shone brightly, few people could stay in the spine for long without suffering an accident. Eragon was one of those few, though not through any particular gift, it seemed to him, but because of persistent vigilance and sharp reflexes. He had hiked in the mountains for years, yet he was still wary of them. Every time he thought that they had surrendered their secrets, something happened to upset his understanding of them, like the stone's appearance. He kept up a brisk pace, and the leagues steadily disappeared. In the late evening, he arrived at the edge of a precipitous ravine. The Enora River rushed far below, heading to Palancar Valley. Gorged with hundreds of tiny streams, the river was a brute force, battling against the rocks and boulders that barred its way. A low rumble filled the air. He camped in a thicket near the ravine and watched the moon rise before going to bed. It grew colder over the next day and a half. Eragon traveled quickly and saw little of the wary wildlife. A bit past noon, he heard the Igualda Falls blanketing everything and the dull sound of 1,000 splashes. The trail led him onto a moist slate outcropping, which the river sped past, flinging itself into empty air and down mossy cliffs. Before him lay Palancar Valley, exposed like an unrolled map. At the base of the Igualda Falls, more than a half-mile below, was the northernmost point of the valley. A little ways from the falls was Carvajal, a cluster of brown buildings. White smoke rose from the chimneys, defiant of the wilderness around it. At this height, farms were small square patches no bigger than the end of his finger. The land around them was tan or sandy, where the dead grass swayed in the wind. The Enora River wound the falls toward Palancar's southern end, reflecting great strips of sunlight. Far in the distance, it flowed past the village Theransford and the lonely mountain Utgard. Beyond that, he knew only that it turned north and ran towards the sea. After a pause, he left the outcropping and started down the trail, grimacing at the descent. When he arrived at the bottom, soft dusk was creeping over everything, blurring colors and shapes into gray masses. Carvajal's lights shimmered nearby in the twilight. The houses cast long shadows. Aside from Theransford, Carvajal was the only village in Palancar Valley. The settlement was secluded and surrounded by harsh, beautiful land. Few traveled here except merchants and trappers. The village was composed of stout log buildings with low roofs, some thatched, others shingled. Smoke billowed from the chimneys, giving the air a woody smell. The buildings had wide porches where people gathered to talk and conduct business. Occasionally, a window brightened as a candle or lamp was lit. Eragon heard men talking loudly in the evening air, while wives scurried to fetch their husbands, scolding them for being late. Eragon wove his way between the houses to the butcher's shop, a broad, thick-beam building. Overhead, the chimney belched black smoke. He pushed the door open. The spacious room was warm and well lit by a fire snapping in the stone fireplace. A bare counter stretched across the far side of the room. The floor was strewn with loose straw. Everything was scrupulously clean, as if the owner spent his leisure time digging in obscure crannies for minuscule pieces of filth. Behind the counter stood the butcher Sloane. A small man, he wore a cotton shirt and a long, blood-stained smock. An impressive array of knives swung from his belt. He had a sallow, pockmarked face, and his black eyes were suspicious. He polished the counter with a ragged cloth. Sloane's mouth twisted as Eragon entered. "Well, the mighty hunter joins the rest of us mortals. How many did you bag this time?" "None," was Eragon's curt reply. He had never liked Sloane. The butcher always treated him with disdain, as if he were something unclean. A widower, Sloane seemed to care only for one person, his daughter, Katrina, on whom he doted. "I'm amazed," said Sloane with affected astonishment. He turned his back on Eragon to scrape something off the wall. "And that's your reason for coming here?" "Yes," admitted Eragon uncomfortably. "If that's the case, let's see your money." Sloane tapped his fingers when Eragon shifted his feet and remained silent. "Come on, either you haven't or you don't. Which is it?" "I don't really have any money, but I do." "What? No money?" The butcher cut him off sharply. "And you expect to buy meat? Are there other merchants giving away their wares? Should I just hand you the goods without charge? Besides," he said abruptly, "it's late. Come back tomorrow with money. I'm closed for the day." Eragon glared at him. "I can't wait until tomorrow, Sloane. It'll be worth your while, though. I found something to pay you with." He pulled out the stone with a flourish and set it gently on the scarred counter, where it gleamed with the light from the dancing flames. "Stole it is more likely," muttered Sloane, leaning forward with an interested expression. Ignoring the comment, Eragon asked, "Will this be enough?" Sloane picked up the stone and gauged its weight speculatively. He ran his hands over its smoothness and inspected the white veins. With a calculating look, he set it down. "It's pretty, but do you know how much it's worth?" "I don't know," admitted Eragon, "but no one would have gone to the trouble of shaping it unless it had some value." "Obviously," said Sloane with exaggerated patience, "but how much value? Since you don't know, I suggest you find a trader who does, or take my offer of 3 crowns. That's a miser's bargain. It must be worth at least 10 times that, protested Eragon. 3 crowns would not even buy enough meat to last a week. Sloane shrugged. If you don't like my offer, wait until the traders arrive. Either way, I'm tired of this conversation. The traders were a nomadic group of merchants and entertainers who visited Carvajal every spring and winter. They bought whatever excess the villagers and local farmers had managed to grow or make, and sold what they needed to live through another year. Seeds, animals, fabric, supplies like salt and sugar. But Eragon did not want to wait until they arrived. It could be a while, and his family needed the meat now. Fine, I accept, he snapped. Good, I'll get you the meat, not that it matters. But where did you find this? 2 nights ago in the spine? Get out, demanded Sloane, pushing the stone away. He stomped furiously to the end of the counter and started scrubbing old bloodstains off a knife. Why? Asked Eragon and drew the stone closer as if to protect it from Sloane's wrath. I won't deal in anything you bring back from those damned mountains. Take your sorcerer's stone elsewhere. Sloane's hand suddenly slipped and he cut a finger on his knife, but he seemed not to notice. He continued to scrub, staining the blade with fresh blood. You refuse to sell to me? Yes, unless you pay with coins, Sloane growled and hefted the knife sidling away. Go, before I make you. The door behind him slammed open, and Eragon whirled around, ready for more trouble. In stomped Horst, a hulking man. Sloane's daughter, Katrina, a tall girl of 16, trailed behind him with a determined expression. Eragon was surprised to see her. She usually absented herself away from any arguments involving her father. Sloane glanced at them warily and then started to accuse Eragon. He won't... Quiet, announced Horst in a rumbling voice, cracking his knuckles at the same time. He was Carvajal's smith, and as his thick neck and scarred leather apron attested. His powerful arms were bare to the elbow. A great expanse of hairy muscular chest was visible through the top of his shirt. A black beard, carelessly trimmed, roiled and knotted like his jaw muscles. Sloane, what have you done now? Nothing. He gave Eragon a murderous glaze, then spat. This boy came in here and started badgering me. I asked him to leave, but he won't budge. I even threatened him and he still ignored me. Sloane seemed to shrink as he looked at Horst. Is this true? Demanded the smith. No, replied Eragon. I offered this stone as payment for some meat, and he accepted it. When I told him that I found it in the spine, he refused to even touch it. What difference does it make where it came from? Horst looked at the stone cautiously, then returned his attention to the butcher. Why won't you trade with him, Sloane? I've no love of the spine myself, but if it's a question of the stone's worth, I'll back it with my own money. The question hung in the air for a moment, then Sloane licked his lips and said, This is my own store. I can do whatever I want. Katrina stepped out from behind Horst and tossed back her auburn hair like a spray of molten copper. Father, Eragon is willing to pay. Give him the meat and then we can have supper. Sloane's eyes narrowed dangerously. Go back to the house. This is none of your business. I said, go. Katrina's face hardened, then she marched out of the room with a stiff back. Eragon watched with disapproval but dared not interfere. Horst tugged at his beard before saying reproachfully, Fine, you can deal with me. What were you going to get, Eragon? His voice reverberated through the room. As much as I could. Horst pulled out a purse and then counted out a pile of coins. Give me your best roasts and steaks. Make sure it's enough to fill Eragon's pack. The butcher hesitated, his gaze darting between Horst and Eragon. Not selling to me would be a very bad idea, stated Horst. Glowering venomously, Sloane slipped into the back room. A frenzy of chopping, rapping, and low cursing reached them. After several uncomfortable minutes, he returned with an armful of wrapped meat. His face was expressionless as he accepted Horst's money, then proceeded to clean his knife, pretending that they were not there. Horst scooped up the meat and walked outside. Eragon hurried behind him, carrying his pack and the stone. The crisp night air rolled over their faces, refreshing after the stuffy shop. Thank you, Horst. Uncle Garrow would be pleased. Horst laughed quietly. Don't thank me. I've wanted to do that for a long time. Sloane's a vicious troublemaker. It does him good to be humbled. Katrina heard what was happening and ran to fetch me. Good thing I came. The two of you were almost at blows. Unfortunately, I doubt he'll serve you or any of your family the next time you go in there. even if you do have coins. Why did he explode like that? We've never been friendly, but he's always taken our money, and I've never seen him treat Katrina that way, said Eragon, opening the top of his pack. Horst shrugged. Ask your uncle. He knows more about it than I do. Eragon stuffed the meat into his pack. Well, now I have one more reason to hurry home, to solve this mystery. Here, this is rightfully yours. He proffered the stone. Horst chuckled. No, you keep your strange rock. As for payment, Albrecht plans to leave for Feinster next spring. He wants to become a master smith, and I'm going to need an assistant. You could come work off your debt in your spare days. Eragon bowed slightly, delighted. Horst had 2 sons, Albrecht and Baldur, both of whom worked in his forge. Taking one's place was a generous offer. Again, thank you. I look forward to working with you. He was glad that there was a way for him to pay Horst. His uncle would never accept charity. Then Eragon remembered what his cousin had told him before he left on the hunt. Roran wanted me to give Katrina a message, but I can't. Can you get it to her? Of course. He wants her to know that he'll come into town as soon as the merchants arrive, and that he will see them then. That all? Eragon was slightly embarrassed. No. He also wants her to know that she is the most beautiful girl he has ever seen and that he thinks of nothing else. Horst's face broke into a broad grin, and then he winked at Eragon. Getting serious, isn't he? Hello. Does it still say that I'm playing something I'm not supposed to be? I updated it. No, it says there we go. Yeah, it says I'm doing the right thing. But other than that, hello. How are you? Yes, sir, Eragon answered with a quick smile. Could you also give her my thanks? It was nice of her to stand up to her father for me. I hope she isn't punished because of it. Roran would be furious if I got her into trouble. I wouldn't worry about it. Sloane doesn't know that she called me, so I doubt he'll be too hard on her. Before you go, will you sup with us? I'm sorry, but I can't. Garrow is expecting me, said Eragon, tying off the top of his pack. He hoisted it onto his back and started down the road, raising his hand in farewell. The meat slowed him down, but he was eager to be home, and renewed vigor filled his steps. The village ended abruptly, and he left its warm lights behind. The pearlescent moon peeked over the mountains, bathing the land in a ghostly reflection of daylight. Everything looked bleached and flat. Near the end of his journey, he turned off the road, which continued south. A simple path that led through the waist-high grass and up a knoll, almost hidden by the shadows of the protective elm trees. He crested the hill and saw a gentle light shining from his home. The house had a shingled roof and a brick chimney. Eaves hung over the whitewashed walls, shadowing the ground below. One side of the enclosed porch was filled with split wood, ready for the fire. A jumble of farm tools was cluttered on the other side. The house had been abandoned for half a century when they moved in after Garrow's wife, Marion, died. It was 10 miles from Carvajal, farther than anyone else's. People considered the distance dangerous because the family could not rely on help from the village in times of trouble, but Eragon's uncle would not listen. 100 feet from the house, in a dull-colored barn, lived 2 horses, Burka and Brua, with chickens and a cow. Sometimes there was also a pig, but they had been unable to afford one this year. A wagon wedged between the stalls. On the edge of the fields, a thick line of trees traced along the Enora River. He saw a light move behind a window as he warily reached the porch. Uncle, it's Eragon. Let me in. The small shutter slid back for a second, then the door swung inward. Garrow stood with his hand on the door. His worn clothes hung on him like rags on a stick frame. A lean, hungry face with intense eyes gazed out from under graying hair. He looked like a man who had been partly mummified before it was discovered that he was still alive. Roran's sleeping, was his answer to Eragon's inquiring gaze. A lantern flickered on a wood table so old that the grain stood up like tiny ridges like a giant fingerprint. Near a wood stove were rows of cooking utensils tacked onto the wall with homemade nails. A second door opened to the rest of the house. The floor was made of boards polished smooth by years of tramping feet. Eragon pulled off his pack and took out the meat. "What's this? Did you buy meat? Where did you get the money?" asked his uncle harshly as he saw the wrapped packages. Eragon took a breath before answering. "No, Horst bought it for us." "You let him pay for it? I told you before, I won't beg for our food. If we can't feed ourselves, we might as well move into town. Before you can turn around twice, they'll be sending us used clothes and asking us if we'll be able to make it through the winter." Garrow's face paled with anger. "I didn't accept charity," snapped Eragon. "Horst agreed to let me work off the debt this spring. He needs someone to help him because Albrecht is going away." "And where will you get the time to work for him? Are you going to ignore the things that need to be done here?" asked Garrow, forcing his voice down. Eragon hung his bow and quiver on the hooks beside the front door. "I don't know how I'll do it," he said irritably. "Besides, I found something that could be worth some money." He set the stone on the table. Garrow bowed over it. The hungry look on his face became ravenous. His fingers moved with a strange twitch. "You found this in the spine?" "Yes," said Eragon. He explained what happened. "And to make matters worse, I lost my best arrow. I'll have to make more before long." They stared at the stone in the near darkness. "How was the weather?" asked his uncle, lifting the stone. His hands tightened around it like he was afraid it would suddenly disappear. "Cold," was Eragon's reply. "It didn't snow, but it froze each night." Garrow looked worried by the news. "Tomorrow you'll have to help Roran finish harvesting the barley. If we can get the squash picked too, the frost won't bother us." He passed the stone to Eragon. "Here, keep it. When the traders come, we'll find out what it's worth. Selling it is probably the best thing to do. The less we're involved with magic, the better." "Why did Horst pay for this meat?" It only took a moment for Eragon to explain his argument with Sloane. "I just don't understand what angered him so." Garrow shrugged. Sloane's wife, Ismira, went over the Igualda Falls a year before you were brought here. He hasn't been near the spine since, nor had anything to do with it. But that's no reason to refuse payment. I think he just wanted to give you trouble." Eragon swayed blearily and said, "It's good to be back." Garrow's eyes softened, and he nodded. Eragon stumbled to his room, pushed the stone under his bed, and then fell onto the mattress. Home. For the first time since before the hunt, he relaxed completely as sleep overtook him. Hello everybody, thank you so much for watching that. I had a blast reading Eragon. It'll be a little while, unfortunately, before I get the next one going. I need to have time to stream it. And it's obviously been a little while since I did the stream, considering my face was a lot different. School and work has been a little hectic, along with some other personal things that I've been going through. So bear with me. I do want to keep doing it. It's really fun, considering that I'm reading my favorite book series, and then I'll be able to experience it with all of you guys. Next time, though, at the end, I'm going to be doing a little bit of a questionnaire. I'll be asking a couple questions about what went on in the chapters, and what do you think whoever said, you know, why did Brahm say we have to go to this place, or why did Brahm not want Eragon to do Edic, or why did Eragon do this, or, you know, so on, just trying to make you think a little deeper about the text. Maybe we'll see how that goes. Yeah, anyway, thanks again for watching, guys. I hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and I will see you next time. Bye.